Welcome back as we get into Shivering Isles, which is probably my favorite section of this study. It's always been my favorite expansion, favorite DLC, how we frame that, of the series, because it's obviously the most explicitly philosophical and psychological in that we're dealing with order and madness, and there's all kinds of applications or lenses we can use to analyze this. I think of Carl Jung, I think of Kierkegaard, which is my primary wheelhouse. And so I've always really been drawn to the Shivering Isles. I'm going to avoid monologuing right now. I'll have opportunity to do that. So maybe I should start by asking kind of your initial thoughts, experience. I know, Ian, you've been replaying it. So why don't you just start off with some general thoughts, kind of wherever you want to go with this. Ian, you want to kick us off?
I'm not gonna lie, I was really disappointed when you said I'm not gonna monologue.
Well, I mean, I figured I gotta kind of hedge this a little bit because I also have my solo video I need to do where I'm really going to get structured. But don't worry, I'm sure I'll do some impromptu monologues along the way.
I'm looking for something. Could we give the honor to Tyler?
Sure.
So, I mean, actually, the first time I even played Shivering Isles was actually with the remaster. So, because what I said, I blew through the main story of Oblivion. That was kind of my own really first go at it. But it's really interesting coming at this from a clinical perspective, being that I work, in a clinical perspective with the mental health counseling.
Yeah.
And it was almost this little joke where it's like I'm kind of walking through with my DSM-5 and just like, all right, narcissistic personality disorder. We got a schizoid personality disorder. And it just kind of walking through the different characters and just kind of seeing how, especially for the writing, they definitely were pulling some of like Sheldon is like this classic like narcissist, and it's just beautiful. As someone who's actually worked with some narcissistic personality disorder, it's just really just like, oh man, that harkens back to some troubling times. But then just kind of displaying it in such a I enjoy kind of the absurdity of it, where you're getting to explore some of like this goofy dark side of brains and our minds and our spirits and where it can go and once again in a very entertaining way, especially with Sheogorath's just madness of it all and just the beauty of the delivery of it all is great. So I mean, I've got a lot of thoughts as far as even just kind of exploring the whole idea of dementia and mania, the two splits and kind of like what ties it together. I mean, it's just all really interesting because I kind of start going on just word deep dives too, because we have our very, modern words for dementia, and you think of, just like the clinical diagnosis of like, degenerative brain disorders. But even looking back at historically, where, it's this, the thing that ties them both together is a loss of reason. And in their very unique ways. And I just found that really entertaining to kind of deep dive further into. So those are just some.
Yeah, yeah, and that the fact that both sides are abandoning reason, but in very different kind of ways. On the mania side, at that level, they're abandoning reason by becoming overly expressive. They're losing sight of limitations, the kind of limitations you need to actually be particular people using logic, using reason, which operates in a particular limited kind of way. And so when you just give yourself over to the totally boundless, you lose yourself entirely. And Kierkegaard talks a lot about this. This is what he would refer to as the despair of infinitude, where you're giving yourself over to just open possibilities so much that you aren't actually anything anymore. And as much as Kierkegaard is often treated as this radical subjectivist, in reality, he's very much, or he would be at least, a very harsh critic of contemporary postmodernism. In that, he, in really referencing the romantics of his own day, he really makes the point that as soon as everything becomes possible, you lose everything because you no longer have any boundaries. But then on the other side, on the dementia side, you have what he would refer to as the despair of finitude, where now you are so bound by a lack of possibility that you are given over to neurosis. You kind of get lost within yourself. You don't see and he expands the possibilities before you. And so this is why everybody is just stuck inside their own heads because they're too limited. They have lost sight of possibility, whereas Mania side has given itself over to possibility. But what the self does for Kierkegaard, the authentic integrated self, is you take the limitations of finitude, you take the boundaries of what human nature is and what it can be, you take the limitations of your own particular life and the things that you just can't get around. You embrace those limitations, but with a spirit of possibility, recognizing that you are someone who's capable of change, right? And so to be an authentic self, you don't just give yourself over to one side or the other, and you don't even hold them in tension. You integrate them together, right? That's exactly what you end up doing, as the character going through this story to a level that even Sheogorath isn't capable of doing, because he holds both of them in tension. Whereas what the real psychological hero does is he integrates the possible and the actual together. Um, so I guess there's my impromptu monologue.
Yeah, what I found interesting too, just you brought up Kierkegaard, so I read Sickness Unto Death, this week, and just looking at those despairs, and then seeing Sheogorath, and even Jyggalag too, where they're both like this defiant despair, right? Like the most defiant despair, and those two spectrums where you've got this complete chaos and then you've got this complete reason, and they're both willing into their own being, but without what Kierkegaard looks for is faith and that full integration, and seeing that they're once again two sides of the same coin in a way, and just seeing all the imagery and stuff like that, it's just really it was really interesting to look at, and then seeing the player character coming in and like trying and working to integrate, and but even looking what that looks at future wise in this Elder Scrolls, I have no idea, but but just seeing that in the story is just really interesting pulled together.
Yeah, yeah. I appreciate that you brought in the sickness unto death, which it's exactly the framework I'm using, obviously, and that's what I'm really going to focus in on for the asynchronous video I put out there, looking at through that lens. Yeah, Sheogorath, he really embodies what Kierkegaard calls like the demonic, defiant sort of despair, where in despair he is willing himself to be something that he knows that he isn't, that he's not. Like he knows that he is Jyggalag, like that's his true identity, but he is trying to will himself to be something entirely different, to operate outside those bounds. But in so doing, he enters into madness and he loses sight of himself altogether, until you, as the player character, are able to integrate the mad god into a psychology of reason. So you're able to take this together and then go off and solve the Oblivion crisis. Like, when I play these games, I always like to give my character like some kind of story, backstory, motivation, that sort of thing. I feel like one advantage of fiction is that you get to live different kinds of lives, like whether you're reading a book or playing a game. That's one value of fiction. And so, I'm playing this, good divine crusader type, and now I'm trying to justify what am I doing here in the Shivering Isles? And, playing around with this crazy Daedra, and and the way that I'm approaching it is really this idea of like you need to, I mean, to swap psychological philosophers here, like you need to incorporate your shadow, like you need to recognize the monstrous potential that you have, and you don't give yourself over to it, but you find a way to, well, integrate a certain degree of chaos in the pursuit of greater order. And so I think that, I don't know, there's a lot there that we could go on. Ian, did you find what you were looking for?
Sort of, yes and no. Yeah, I'm terribly sorry. I was only kind of half listening there because I am a terrible multitasker. So, like for somebody who is so let's say for people who are fans of the Elder Scrolls, but but they don't necessarily know who Kierkegaard is. I'm not saying I'm that person, but I am that person. What's a quick rundown of Kierkegaard, like who he is and kind of generally what he writes about.
See if I make this as succinct as possible because he's a very obscure writer who goes all over the place. But I mean, he basically, he's coming out of the Danish state Lutheranism, which at that point had become very cold, very rationalistic. The idea that you're born into the state church, and by virtue of being a citizen of Denmark, well, you're also a citizen of the church, and that is essentially what Christianity is. It's entirely cultural, very much driven by rationalistic philosophy. And Kierkegaard is trying to reassert this authentic vibrancy of the Christian faith. And so he takes much more of an inward turn, focusing on the fact that, like, to be a Christian, to be an authentic self, requires that you make actual decisions. It's not enough that you're just born into a Christian culture. You have to make a decision. You have to live a life, as he says, that is contemporaneous with Christ, meaning as a real lived reality. And so in his psychological texts, like The Sickness Unto Death, he's looking at kind of different pathways that people can walk in trying to put their life together. And so on one side, you'll have the hyper rationalists who see everything, well, much like Jyggalag, or much like who's the librarian guy that you meet toward the end?
Dias.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And so, that would be the hyper rationalist. Everything is going to happen the way it's going to happen because, well, that's how logic plays out, right? That things are going to happen the way that they're going to happen. But on the other side of Kierkegaard, on the other side, from the opposite side of the rationalists, what you have is the romantics. The romantics who are just saying, like, anything goes, free love, there's no boundaries, kind of like, I mean, in many ways, the predecessors to the hippies, right? Is that sort of mentality. And so Kierkegaard says, okay, you go off into hyper rationalism and you're going to lose yourself because you're no longer actually making decisions. You're just becoming a product of fate. And that's not really what a person is. And then on the other side, if you give yourself over to the just crazy openness of the romantics, well, you also lose yourself because to be human is to have certain limitations, certain structures. We are made a certain way and we are made to live a certain kind of way. We can't just create ourselves from the bottom up, as some of the later existentialists will say. And so he's really saying, on one level, the rationalists are in a state of despair because they're losing what it means to be human. The romantics are in a state of despair because they're losing what it means to be human. And that right there, we have the extremes of dementia and mania, right? Whereas the the authentic self is going to not just grab the possibility of the romantics and the kind of impossibility or the impassibility of the rationalists. But what we're going to do is we're going to bring these things together and say, yes, reason is, well, it's real. There's reality to logic. There's also a certain givenness to human nature, but also we are full of possibility. And there are all kinds of decisions that we have to make. And if we're making real decisions, well, then there's a certain degree of chaos. There's a certain degree of openness to reality and the path that's before us. And so what we need to do, we affirm our limitations, but we also recognize the possibility that's required for us to make movements in taking those limitations where they're supposed to go. Um, so was that helpful?
Yes. Yes, it
Okay,
was. Thank
good.
you. I was starting like I was starting to see. Okay, okay. I think I see where he's making the Mania and Dementia connection. Like we're kind of drawing the dots here a little bit, or connecting the dots. Excuse me. So yeah, yeah, I get that. That's cool. Thank you very much. So I guess I'm trying to figure out like where to start or like how to I was hoping that I was going to get to write some stuff down before we started. Um to keep it short, that's not how life played out. So but I'm trying to think how I want to like how I want to like kind of like broach the topic. So the a big thing that's going on here in Shivering Isles, which is we're getting into some actual like philosophy within the world of the Elder Scrolls itself, is it's a process called mantling, also known as the Enantiomorph, which is one of the six walking ways outlined by Vivek. And the six walking ways are in the Elder Scrolls are basically this idea of they're different philosophical approaches to transcendence of some kind, whether it's apotheosis, whether whether it's achieving CHIM, whether it's just kind of one thing or the other. A lot of them are all kind of uh a lot of them are all they kind of sort of lead to the same outcome. Some of them are different. Some of them are a little different. Some of them are just kind of different paths to the same thing. But mantling is, and this is kind of like I've been studying this a lot, and I'm still struggling to adequately describe it. But mantling is basically when you basically become somebody else, essentially. So like it really so like the most obvious example, of course, of what we're talking about right now is in Oblivion, which is the champion of Cyrodiil mantles Sheogorath, and the champion himself becomes the new mad god. I think the phrase that is used in the games, I can't remember where the quote is. The, but the phrase is, "You walk like them until they must walk like you." So there's kind of like this idea going on that all of the actions that you take, and this is what Sheogorath is actually like doing to you from beginning to end. Like you are his contingency plan. He at one point he calls you like a good little rat in a maze. He's like kind of like emphasizing essentially his uh his control over you, essentially, where all of everything that he's telling you to do is something that he himself would do. So in basically you are living like Sheogorath, you are acting like Sheogorath, you are walking in his footsteps, and in doing that, you actually have kind of like this uh this uh this transcendental process that happens, this enantiomorph, this or it, put in more using English words, the steps of the dead, essentially, where you are basically becoming an incarnation of somebody else, usually a divine figure who is dead. Now, Sheogorath doesn't really die, but he ceases to be when he becomes Jyggalag. So when he ceases to become Jyggalag, you become the new the new Sheogorath. This sort of thing also happens in Morrowind. It's not mantling exactly. It's not in the exact same way. I think it's called. I think the word they actually use in Morrowind is incarnation, where you know uh, the Nerevarine becomes the Nerevarine because he like walks in the steps of Nerevar himself, and in walking in the path of Nerevar becomes a Nerevarine, becomes an incarnation, an echo of Nerevar, and it's actually like the reason why you are sent to Morrowind in the first place by the Emperor, because the Emperor kind of has like, if I remember right, the Emperor himself actually has like a dream. Essentially, he has a lot of those. If you kind of like if you remember, if you know anything about Uriel the Seventh, but he kind of has like this dream that oh, this guy, like this guy might be the Nerevarine that breaks the Tribunal's hold on Morrowind. Um, so that's kind of like that idea. There's also other examples of mantling in the Elder Scrolls are Talos evidently kind of mantles Lorkhan when he becomes the ninth divine. Mannimarco, the Altmer's necromancer, he attempts mantling several times. In Elder Scrolls Online, the main plot of that game is that he's attempting to use the Amulet of Kings to trap Molag Bal's soul and like mantle Molag Bal and become the new Molag Bal. Long story short, that fails, and in Daggerfall, he decides, well, I guess I'll become a moon instead. And because of the way the Numidium works and Dragon Breaks work, where kind of like all paths kind of converge and become true at the same time, he both fails and succeeds, which is why we see a physical uh, Mannimarco in the flesh in the Oblivion Mages Guild quest line. So he's kind of so he kind of does Mannimarco does kind of a Schrodinger's cat there. He's kind of both alive and dead. That's a bit of a tangent. I apologize, but yeah, that's kind of the gist of what mantling is. There's other examples of mantling and incarnation. Pelinal Whitestrake, who we've mentioned before from the Song of Pelinal and the Knights of the Nine DLC, who was the champion of Elisha and the humans during the Slave Rebellion, and who I argue the champion of Cyrodiil also mantles Pelinal Whitestrake before ultimately mantling Sheogorath.
Now, um, I'm still trying to wrap my mind around what this means. Because on one hand, you talk about walking in the steps of the person, and you kind of become that person, like we get in Shivering Isles and potentially elsewhere in the lore. And I think of like the imitation of Christ idea, that idea of theosis, or as we sort of walk the walk, well, it through the application of grace as well. I mean, it's a not literal incarnation, but a type of incarnation. Yeah, that's what the scripture refers to the church as the body of Christ, right? It's a kind of incarnation. But now, when we take this to the Elder Scrolls lore, I mean, say in Shivering Isles, what are you literally becoming Sheogorath? Like, is this are you taking the title, or are you like literally becoming the person? I don't fully understand exactly what's happening.
So so my understanding again, like again, this has been kind of hard for me to wrap my head around too, and I feel like there are people who could do a better job than me. My understanding is that, and this was something that was uh like just mildly upsetting to me personally, just kind of like as a player many years ago. My understanding is that your character and also canonically the champion of Cyrodiil like literally becomes Sheogorath. Like essentially, and you get allusions to this in Skyrim, in the Skyrim quest when you meet Sheogorath, and Sheogorath makes some really interesting that Sheogorath makes some really interesting comments about Martin Septim, and maybe like maybe like one or two other events that happened in the Oblivion games that kind of suggest that uh, he and the champion are kind of one and the same person. Other things that I was looking up that I didn't really have time. I didn't have time to dig into further, which only made this even more confusing. Which was so there's this famous prophet in the Shivering Isles called Arden Sul, and the Manics have their version of kind of who Arden Sul was and what he did and what happened, and the Demented have their version. There's kind of an Anu Padme thing going on there with Arden Sul. Was Lorkhan good? Was Lorkhan bad? We don't know. That seems to be going on with Arden Sul. Apparently, Arden Sul mantled Sheogorath and was Sheogorath at one point, but then he wasn't anymore. So I don't fully understand that. And I also found something somewhere that apparently Haskell mantled Sheogorath at one point, but Haskell's Haskell, and he's like the butler. So if he's the butler, like what did he become Sheogorath and then he wasn't Sheogorath anymore? Like, I don't understand. What's going on? I need somebody smarter than myself. I'm a hack and a fraud.
I just,
But go ahead.
well, I find curious though, keeps you think about the cycle each era where, Sheogorath turns into Jyggalag, right? And then Jyggalag eventually becomes Sheogorath again, and there's like this perpetual cycle of like this t turning into. Well, I wonder like if like a character does mantle Sheogorath, and for whatever reason doesn't anymore. It would eventually then Jyggalag then revert into Sheogorath. It gets I just there's like this melting pot of like what is happening kind of thing going on. And try yeah, even just like I'm trying to bring reason to the mad god is what I'm doing.
Yeah, who's really mad? Sheogorath or the three people sitting in this call?
Yeah, I think the real struggle here comes down to like in the Elder Scrolls lore, like what exactly does it mean to be a person? Like, what does it mean to be? I mean, what is existence? I mean, now,
Yeah.
I mean,
I
in the Elder
think
Scrolls,
I
isn't it?
think we
Good.
understand why Menkar Cameron lost his mind at this point. Go ahead.
I mean, it isn't and Ian, you can probably speak to this better than I can, but I mean, isn't like the existence itself something like a dream?
Yeah, so there is kind of this idea in Elder Scrolls. So one of the things that will help us like going into this is that so there's actually like a couple of levels on which like the world and its philosophy and like its ontology and everything, it can be interpreted in a couple of different ways. It can be interpreted in universe, in narrative, which is what we here are doing most of the time. There's also kind of a meta interpretation. So to and a lot of what Kirkbride and these other writers are doing. I wish I could remember the names of the other writers because there are other writers other than Kirkbride who are smart and just incredible writers, and I can never remember their names, and I feel like a terrible person. But what all of these guys are doing with Elder Scrolls philosophy partly is just kind of using it uh using it to kind of like I don't know if contextualize is the right word. Basically the idea that like Elder Scrolls is a game that knows it's a game. Like there's a lot going on kind of like with Kim, with Amaranth, with what whatever, where it's like okay, it's like you can interpret that, you can kind of like interpret it as like with like a lot of stuff that like Vivek is saying. I don't have like quotes pulled up, but basically like oh, this is kind of Vivek talking about like Kirkbride is writing and kind of like using philosophical concepts, basically just to say, oh, this is the player in the middle of the fight and he pauses his game, to get up and take a break and like grab a snack or use the restroom or whatever, and then come back and like get back into the game. And that's kind of like what this passage is saying. Or it's like, oh, the character realizes, when a person kind of has like that realization that oh, they are inside the dream of the godhead, like that it can also be interpreted and understood as the character suddenly has the self-awareness of realizing that he is a video game character that is being played by a player. Or like kind of like Amaranth is kind of like if Kim is kind of like understanding your place in the dream and kind of like becoming a lucid dreamer, like within the dream and being able to exert limited control over it, Amaranth is kind of like leaving the dream altogether. And it's like, hey, like Amaranth is like when the player turns off the game and goes outside. That's so like there's a there's a lot of fun stuff going on there. And I think like there are people who can explain all of this stuff like better than I can. That's basically the gist of it. There's a level to all of this where if we are to understand it in that way, it would probably be healthier for all of us at the end of the day, to just kind of to that while the philosophy is in Elder Scrolls is attempting to do something both serious and unserious at the same time. It's kind of like it's having fun. Like it knows what it is, and it's having fun with itself. And it's like it's they're the creators are obviously exerting a degree of seriousness and excellence into their work, while at the same time not taking themselves so seriously that at the end of the day, they know that, hey, like, this is all, this is all just kind of like a video game, and everything we're writing is just kind of like, kind of pointing to, or or saying that. There's a level to all of this where we say, oh, the Godhead in the dream is just like, oh, it's just like a video game. That can be like overly reductionist, which is not always helpful. And I think this stuff is meant to be taken, like, at the same time seriously on its own terms within the context of the world. There is a quote somewhere in one of the lessons of Vivek. It might be sermon 2, I'm not sure, where like Vivek is still an egg, and he's looking at something. I can't remember exactly what he's looking at. He basically looks at something and says, "Oh, this doesn't mean anything." And then he looks at it again and says, "Oh, this might mean something." And then he looks at this thing a third time and finally comes to the conclusion, yes, people projecting their meanings like onto things. This could be a proverb. And it's kind of like Kirkbride like poking fun at people like reading his 36 sermons and trying to like take it a little too seriously. And it's like, dang, dude.
At
But
the Yeah, but then at the same time, that approach of okay, it is a simulation, right? I mean,
mhm,
that's what the game is, and maybe some
yeah.
of this dream talk is sort of moving in that direction. But that's not entirely unlike primary world philosophies, where we're talking about literal simulation theory, right? I mean, like
Yeah.
Elon Musk says that we're
Yeah.
most likely in a simulation, right? And
Like, yeah,
so
like it's, yeah, simulation theory, and like the Greek, I think the Greeks were like, I think all the Greek philosophers were trying to argue about whether or not we were inside a dream. There was a whole thing about whether or not, reality is an illusion, or whatever. It's all just like, the same ideas keep coming back. There's nothing new under the sun.
right. And so I mean the Matrix idea, I mean it's very old philosophically. And so yeah, I mean maybe we're in a simulation, but maybe we don't even go into the digital simulation route. I mean it's what you're describing is not entirely unlike what you get from the secular existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre, who says that there is no essence. In other words, the only story that there is to discover is the story that we tell. Like to use what you said about Vivek, it's the meaning that we project onto the world. That's the only meaning that exists. And if we begin with that sort of mentality, then we kind of get to the same place within the Elder Scrolls, whereas we can't, when we're talking about mantling and you becoming Sheogorath, like it seems pretty clear that there aren't strong boundaries over individual persons within the game, right? And that's why it is sort of like a dream where the people aren't really real. Like they are kind of just projections that can fade in and out of each other. Like, I mean, if you've ever had a dream before, you know that they don't always make a lot of sense. Like the boundaries aren't always there. Sometimes you can be talking to a person and then they just become someone new and you don't even think anything of it, right? It's just like that's kind of how dreams work. Um, there's no fixed meaning there. And I can easily take kind of what you're saying here and then apply that to a lot of real world philosophies that say like there is no fundamental meta narrative. And then we kind of end up in the same place with the same sort of conclusion where it might make sense to look at a video game series and say, yeah, okay, don't take it too seriously. It's a game. But the problem is if you reject meta narratives in real world philosophy, then you kind of end up in the same place where we say, just don't take it too seriously. All philosophy is just a game, right? That's basically what I deal with a lot, working in academia with my colleagues in the humanities department. Of it's all just kind of made up, and so it doesn't really matter. Which kind of begs the question, why are you teaching? But
I
um,
think I think fortunately in this case we are talking about a game. So it's like it's, and I think in this particular case, like, just like, understanding, like, at the end of the day, that's what this is. That like, just for our own sake, for our own sanity, for our own, like, mental, emotional, and spiritual health. Like, we're like, if we can, we like, we can still both like enjoy the game and engage with the game seriously while also accepting that it's just a game and kind of like the game kind of like being self-aware and having fun with that idea and playing with both sides of the aisle. Um, yeah, like if we're talking about like applying like these arguments that you're talking about like in real life, oh yeah, that's annoying, that's insufferable. You know, fortunately for us, like in this particular instance, it is just a game. Now that doesn't mean that, like I said, that doesn't mean that we can't engage with it seriously and do what we are doing right now. Um, there's a lot of enrichment to be uh found in that, I think.
I mean, this even kind of reminds me of, in Tolkien's on fairy stories, just like what the role of even like fairy stories are. And the image of the wiping away, like the condensation or the fog on the window, the games kind of provide that opportunity for us at times too, of like when we're diving into the simulation and enjoying the narrative, the meta narrative, even just trying to like grapple with these things. It allows us to then kind of wake up, and when we do touch grass again, it's like a new appreciation for the real in a way where it gives us like this greater sense of being in a sense when we grapple with this unreal these shadows of things. And I think when we're able to shift our perspective in a way that engages us with a healthy way, because even looking at the way that many people, and when you see the lore discourse in Elder Scrolls, like people are going for answers. And I'm sure that part of the infuriating part of something, the ways that the writers do deal with these things is that people are looking for real. But you need to take a step back and realize you're not dealing with real right now. And so then you can have more clarity in what is happening here. And to me, when I kind of look at when I earlier in the Discord, I kind of was saying like was very reductionistic. I'm just like the idea of the towers and all the meta narrative of Elder Scrolls were like, I am God, the tower's the console. Like the Elder Scrolls are just discs, the CDs, and then the developers or the Age for Daedra, and it's all just fun, right? But in a sense, when you look at it through that lens, it's like, okay, there's a certain bit of unseriousness here, which allows us to enjoy playing through the serious and enjoy it, and rather than trying to have like, it's instead of trying to have canon, it's stop. It's fun.
Mhm. There is a so like I wasn't like I knew so when you went on that little rant, like I knew immediately what you were putting down. I didn't realize that there was actually a video that you were referencing, and then I found that video and I watched it. So that's actually a good what was the name of that guy? I can't remember. I would like to plug it. There is a guy who basically interprets like the philosophy of the towers within Elder Scrolls, and he does it in a very meta narrative way where it's like, oh, the wheel of the Orbis is the disc, the your PC tower is literally a tower, and so on and so forth. Kotho also has a video on the six walking ways, and he like approaches it like with like an in-world understanding of what these philosophical ideas mean. And those two videos are like very, very good if you kind of want like an all-around kind of understanding of like an introduction to an all-around understanding of kind of like what these ideas are before you kind of go further, deeper into it for yourself, if you want.
And I guess if I don't know if it's the same video that you're referencing, because I actually kind of pulled that together after watching Darloth's tower video, is actually where I
Yeah,
was. He
Dariloth
kind of hints at it a little bit.
Dariloth plugged a video
Yeah.
where a guy is like literally saying like the wheel of the Orbis is the disc. Um like and that's like I never so I watched Daraloth's Tower video, which is an excellent, that's an excellent masterclass video right there. I never actually watched the video he was plugging, and I watched that and I realized, oh, this is what Tyler's talking about.
I actually didn't see that video, but
That's hilarious because everything you said was pretty much word for word from
that's
that video. That
pretty
is
funny.
wild.
See, I guess I all this talk of like the world is the game, that sort of thing. I just don't find that very compelling. Maybe that's their intention, right? But I'm just saying that if that's their intention, I disagree with it because, like to go back to on fairy stories, right? Tolkien says that a fairy story can engage in humor, it can engage in satire, but what it can't do is satirize its own rules, its own magic.
Mhm.
Because at that point, it no longer really is a story that provides escape. It's just I don't know. It's too tritely self-aware. A good fairy story, and I would argue that the Elder Scrolls does provide a good fairy story. Maybe not the ultimate, maybe not the perfect, but it does provide a certain level of escape that I think is useful. And I would say that in those occasions in which it doesn't take itself seriously, I would say that it loses itself as a fairy story, and in so doing, it loses itself as a fantasy game. Um, and so, I like to take it seriously as a sub-created world. Now, when I'm playing the game, doesn't mean I'm getting upset when I feel like the philosophy isn't right. I don't expect the philosophy to be right, but I do find that I don't know. I find enrichment in not looking to the Elder Scrolls canon as scripture, right? I mean, obviously, the people who do that, which leads to some of the heated discussions in the Reddit threads or wherever. Um, but I do think there's a lot of value in maybe taking it even more seriously than it takes itself, and I don't know, engaging with those ideas while still having fun. I don't know. Maybe my idea of fun is a little too academic, but
No, I 100% agree with what you're saying. I mean, I think the no, I think the I don't ha I didn't write these thoughts down exactly, so I'm trying not to talk in circles and repeat myself. Uh, but I think again, like I think there's room for both, and that they're both valid. But I like on the whole, I agree with what you're saying, and I think like Elder Scrolls can absolutely be engaged with in that way, and there is value in that.
I think it just kind of gets into the weird medium of what, like a weird sub-creative medium that video games are. And I know like this has been a conversation previously before, but just sub-creation, like its purest form, as I said, as Tolkien would argue. I mean, the written word has, there's a lot more that we can put into it, and then the more that it preaches to us, the less that we get to create into it. And like video games have this really weird medium where we're able to put ourselves into this situation, but not. And there's boundary, there's parameters, which also are like healthy and good because I mean, imagine if Elder Scrolls does pull away a lot of boundaries, which can sometimes make the game aimless. And we have to put those boundaries on ourselves sometimes because next thing you know, you're just sitting there looking at the stars for an hour next to a campsite in Skyrim and not doing anything. And it's like, what am I doing here? But we have to kind of clamp these boundaries onto us. And so even just like thinking about that, like just from the dizziness of freedom idea, where it's like we don't, where do I even go? And where, even just grappling with that is a kind of a healthy way to engage with the game in a way where it's like enjoying the boundaries, enjoying the limits in a way that help us, like I said, enjoy a narrative where we can learn something or experience something that's actually meaningful.
yeah, when we're talking about a fantasy series, we're naturally going to talk Tolkien all the time. At least that's where I go. And Tolkien makes the point that yeah, that literature, that books do provide the kind of quintessential sub-creative medium compared to film. I mean, in his lifetime, they were talking about making movies out of Lord of the Rings, and he seemed to be okay with the idea if it were done correctly. But even then, he recognized it to be an inferior medium because in a book, the audience or the reader also gets to engage in subcreation. If we had never seen the Jackson movies or or the ones that came before it, if then you have to cast like what do these people look like? What do they sound like? Beyond the exact words on the page, like what does it feel like in this room? What's the tone like? And so you engage in the sub-creative process, and in so doing, you become part of the story in a unique kind of way versus just watching a movie and having all the creative decisions made for you. Well, I think that video games are potentially moving us in the direction of literature versus a movie because you do have certain boundaries that are given to you. Otherwise, you don't have a story. You don't have a world that you're entering into. So there are boundaries, but also you have freedom to operate within those boundaries to shape what the story is, and especially so in an open world game like what Bethesda tends to give us. And so that's one reason why I argue that certain games can fulfill at least a quasi literary role as we partake in the subcreation that has already been subcreated. Like it's a give and a take. And so, yeah. And so I don't know. That's one reason why I kind of like, I not kind of, I do like to take these games seriously because I think then they become more enriching. They can become more fun because you are truly engaging in subcreation rather than just, fiddling around and wasting time, which is that's the chief criticism against playing video games, right? That it's a waste of time. And it very much can be, but I also would argue it can be very enriching, perhaps even as enriching as reading a good novel.
I would just say, even as we've been engaging with, as the Mythic Mind in general has been engaging with, talking through games like that, like when you guys were going through the Mass Effect series, I was playing along kind of as you guys were going through it. And it was a new experience to the game to actually like bring a new level of thinking to it. So even as I'm playing through like the Shivering Isles again, like it was just once again like bringing a little, it's almost like bringing a little bit of more of myself to the game instead of just like purely role playing, we're bringing a little bit more of the real into the world. And it's really fascinating how it opens your eyes once again to just what the the interesting things that the writers are doing, but even maybe not even intentionally doing. It's just what happens when humans do things is that we start bringing these things into it. And I would say like when we're using escape as a way as a without the other parts, like without the without the recovery constellation, when we're just escaping for escaping's sake, we do kind of lose some of the magic that could be happening while you're in a game. Because once again, like being in the Shivering Isles, it brought up usually these thoughts of Kierkegaard, which kind of recenters the idea of like the escape of like despair is faith, like, and how powerful it is. It's not virtue that brings you there, it's faith. And that's just a really gentle reminder that a video game provided, which is just like, what?
Right. I mean, whenever somebody is telling a compelling story, they're saying something real, right? Otherwise, it wouldn't be compelling. It resonates with us on some kind of level, whether we're playing a game, watching a movie, or reading a book, whatever. Like the reason why something stands out is because it's standing out in a way that relates to the substance that we know. So, I don't think necessarily that our writers are intentionally giving us this Kierkegaardian framework. At the same time, I feel like it's very clearly there in the story that they are telling. And as you referenced Tolkien there with this, not just escape, but escape, consolation, and recovery, that engaging with a good story, whether talking about a book, a movie, a video game, engaging with a good story should actually better equip us to live out well in the real world. If it's not doing that, then I would argue that, well, maybe we are just wasting our time, which, I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong necessarily with having a hobby that is just that. But at the same time, Like we do need to recognize our mortality and the fact that we have limited minutes on this earth. And so, if our engagement with the fantastical isn't better equipping us to, even at the very least, like think through life a little bit better, then I think we do have reason to question how we're spending our time. And so, while a lot of people would take that idea and say, okay, well, then we shouldn't play video games, right? Do everything out in the real world. But I don't take that approach. What I would say instead is let's use every opportunity, even things that are just fun, like use every opportunity to, well, find better pathways of meaning in your real life. And I think that if we are looking, if we knock, like that door is going to be opened. We're going to find what it is that we're seeking. And especially so in a compelling story like we get in the Elder Scrolls, like we get in the Shivering Isles. You'll find what you're looking for.
So I found this Kirkbride quote. Uh, I guess I have like a couple of things I'm interested to see where this goes. Number one, I found the Kirkbride quote when basically there was a fan who was voicing kind of like a similar discontent at the idea that everything in Elder Scrolls is just a dream, and Kirkbride kind of answered in a forum post. And I'm not going to give you the whole quote. It's strange because Kirkbride is a very strange man, if you haven't figured that out already. But kind of like the heart of it is he says, I just want to say, I never think I did. He's kind of talking about, oh, it's just a dream. Like, I never did think it was like, just a dream. But you know, he says, I think the whole it's just a dream avenue is completely missing the point. Consider your lucid dreams if you've been lucky enough to ever had one. Then think again before you dismiss the idea of divine hypnagogia. So that's Kirkbride right there for you. I can see the look on your face, Andrew. I'm actually really curious to know like what that's triggering inside you, and I'm very eager to hear that. But as a peer as the part two, I think the fact that we're sitting here having this conversation at all in the first place, the fact that we're having an Elder Scrolls series, the fact that you can look at the lessons of Vivect and Menkar Cameron and just like all this other stuff, or like Maruk the prophet Most Simeon, who we've never got a chance to talk about, my beloved monkey prophet, that crazy monkey. Like the fact that we can sit down and talk about all of this, like to me that means like Elder Scrolls is like there is meaning and value there. Like it is doing its job. Like the fact that we're having this conversation at all tells me that this is doing its job as a piece of art.
Yeah, and absolutely. And even if I mean, I'm certain I don't agree with Kirkbride on a great number of things.
You don't have to. He's a strange man.
He's a strange man, but he spins off some interesting ideas. And I mean, to me, like that is one sign of good storytelling. Not necessarily that I agree with the philosophy, but that we can easily have a philosophical conversation because there's something of substance there. I mean, it's just, same thing about like other religious myths or pagan mythology or whatever. I can look at that and I can find meaning there, whether it's meaning that's inherent within the system, even if I don't take the system as a whole, or by sort of I don't know hitting a wall, I can better understand myself, right, through that experience. And so I don't know, I think that Elder Scrolls does kind of fulfill that. And as far as what Kirkbride said there, honestly, I don't even really know what that means, but I don't think I like how it sounds, but I have no idea what that means.
I don't know if I could uh break it down for you either. I didn't have the time. I've read the quote before. This is how Kirkbride just interacts with people in forums. Like he gives you an answer that's just like kind of frustrating. He does that a lot. People have actually archived all of his posts online. He's got like almost every single one of them is like this. Like he kind of answers your question and he kind of doesn't.
Just like Vivek.
just like Vivek is basically his OC. Like it's basically like both Vivek and Menkar Cameron are basically his mouthpieces for like spouting like his weird ideas like into the world. And it's also actually like there's a lot of he's actually done like a lot of like out of game unofficial stuff. Like with Vivek, there's a book called like The Thief Goes to Cyrodiil, where it's basically like Vivek kind of like traveling somewhat in disguise to Cyrodiil in the Third Era, and he's kind of like answering he's answering questions from the people, which is kind of like both like, oh, it's like the people in Cyrodiil, but it's also he's just answering like forum questions, and he kind of synthesizes the two kind of like into like the narrative of the Elder Scrolls. And it's actually where we get like, so even though like a lot of this stuff isn't necessarily official, it actually gives us a lot of context for the philosophical ideas that are present within the Elder Scrolls, and kind of like gives us the key to throw open the door to discuss them in ways that like, in some of the in-game books may be lacking in.
Now, we've done a lot of sort of meta stuff here. Now,
Way too much.
which I mean
But
is fine. I think it's good, worthwhile conversation.
no, it
But
is. But it's yeah.
to shift it back to Shivering Isles proper here.
I do want to do that. I have a final point because you were asking earlier, like, what is this mantling thing? I think a better example, like probably a more concrete example, and this is something I never would have figured out on my own at all. So I'm gonna shout out Kotho again. He was talking about like mantling being a concept within the Bible, where it's like when Elijah and Elisha go down to the river, and then God comes and whisks up Elijah to heaven, and he leaves his Elijah leaves his mantle behind, and Elisha like picks up Elijah's cloak, and basically kind of like takes on Elijah's role as God's chosen prophet. And in that sense, he's kind of like he's kind of like mantling Elijah and becoming Elijah 2.0 almost. So it's an idea that's kind of like it's kind of present in the Bible. Obviously not in the same way. Absolutely not in the same way, but symbolically there is that idea going on. You can even look at it with you can even see again like symbolically you can see it in other passages where when the Pharisees ask John the Baptist, they say, are you Elijah? And John says, no, I'm not Elijah. But when the disciples talk to Jesus later, Jesus says, yeah, John the Baptist is Elijah, like he is like Elijah returned fulfilling that prophecy.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I guess the struggle for me is that in those situations, they are taking on the symbolic role of the original person, whereas in Elder Scrolls, it seems like you're literally becoming that person rather than just what they represent, right? Like, if the Sheogorath in Skyrim is the hero of Oblivion, like then he's literally just become absorbed into the actual person of Sheogorath rather than
Yeah.
just carrying on the role, right? And
So
that's where things get confusing to me.
yeah, so that was the thing. So my understanding from everything that I have read is that like it's officially canon that the champion of Cyrodiil like became Sheogorath, became the new Sheogorath. That was something that was at the time. I actually have kind of like a take. This is a very personal take. At the time, that was kind of that was kind of upsetting to me at the time when I was younger. And partly because, I like playing those good characters, right? We've talked about this before. I like playing those good characters. I liked the idea that my champion was the guy who was kind of bringing about like this kind of like this Christ-like salvation and new law almost with alongside Martin, where Martin destroys the amulet. We've talked about all of that already. Becomes the avatar of Akatosh, and now we don't need the dragon fires anymore, and all that stuff. I liked the idea that he was kind of like, kind of like bringing about kind of like this new kingdom almost. I liked the idea that he was. I preferred the idea that the champion was mantling Pelinal White Strike. As opposed to the Star Made Knight, as opposed to like Sheogorath, the Daedric god of madness. And it seems to be like a reoccurring theme in Elder Scrolls as well. Like you get to the end of Skyrim with that Dragonborn DLC, and Hermaeus Mora, like that, Hermaeus Mora claims the Dragonborn as his own. Basically says in no uncertain time, in no uncertain terms, you belong to me now. And it's like, and that's like we can talk more about that when we get there. But like it's a reoccurring theme that I find like really irritating, where it's like, I would rather like I would rather be like this other person, other than kind of what the direction that the story is kind of pushing me in. And I kind of had an epiphany recently. So one of my favorite characters in the Bible was Gideon. And it was partly because like off and on in my life, I felt like I could identify a lot with Gideon. Like just feeling like he's, just kind of like a person who's like not really fit for the role, like, a role that he's called to in life. But, nevertheless, God calls him to that role, and, with God's help, he succeeds in all of that. And I was reading the story in Judges. For years, I had never actually read Gideon's story from beginning to end. And it's actually kind of depressing because it doesn't end on that happy, and then Gideon did what God told him to do and they all lived happily ever after. You get to Judges 8, and in verses like 22 to, let's say, 27, the people basically come to Gideon after he has performed his role of judge and has delivered them from it, delivered the people from their enemies, and they want him to rule. They want Gideon to be their leader, and he refuses, but he does something else instead that's really different. He basically tells everybody to gather get all their gold together, and they melt it down, and they turn it into an idol. And it says, and Gideon made an ephod of it, the gold, and put it in the city in Ophrah, and all Israel whored after it, and there it became a snare to Gideon and to his family. And that, when I first read that, that crushed me, right? And the thing that kind of like recentered me and helped me like kind of like better understand all of this in its context. This is related to Shori Goroth, I promise. If you haven't figured out where I'm going with this yet. Uh the like a lot of the so like a lot of these figures in the Bible, these aren't Aesop's fables characters. These aren't like, these aren't all like prescriptive stories for good life. There's a lot of descriptive stories in here. And the point overall of the story of the Bible is that like throughout history, time and again, God proves himself faithful to a faithless people, like kind of like, like again and again and again and again and again. And like Gideon is just kind of like another microcosm of that. Like he's an incredible servant of God, but he still succumbs to idols. And and at the end of the day, Gideon is not Jesus, the one who is really worth kind of like our affection and our adoration and our pursuit. And so I kind of there's a part of me that's kind of like has kind of like, is looking at the champion of Cyrodiil in the context of Gideon. So we've talked before about like, now we bring all of our Christology into the Elder Scrolls, and we've also talked about how like, it's like, obviously it's not like a Christian myth, like, it's not perfect in that way. And when the deeper you get into the Elder Scrolls lore, the more you kind of see like, the cracks and like, certain interpretations may not always necessarily hold up as well as you thought they did the first time. Some do, some don't. But that doesn't mean just because it's not like a Christian myth doesn't mean that we can't like find the Christology in it and pull out the silver linings. And this is kind of like one of the this again, this is just my personal take on the Shivering Isles DLC. And this is kind of like one of those reading the story, rereading the story of Gideon helped me to kind of like accept the Champion of Cyrodiil's place, like in the story in the grand scheme of things. Like, yeah, like, this is not a messianic figure. This is an echo. And even these, mortals, great as they are fallible. I don't know if that makes any sense or if anybody here else, if anyone else here found that as helpful as I did, or if I'm just kind of like spewing nonsense like a citizen of the Shivering Isles.
No, no, no. I think it's a good comparison. And it's a good reminder that even the best heroes in the Bible or even beyond the Bible, like the best heroes, they fulfill a given task, but that task generally is not perfection. They achieve the victory of the day, right? And that's perhaps all we can hope for. And I mean, maybe that's not a bad way of framing it. Um, it's just I don't know. I guess it's difficult from a gameplay perspective because you are the one playing the role, right? Rather than just I identify with this character. It's I'm actually playing this role. I want to achieve victory, not I want to do this thing and then descend into chaos. But I mean, I don't know. But I think it's a good comparison, even if it is still a little bit frustrating.
Like, it is. Like, again, like, because like, yeah, yeah, it's a game. So, when you're actually playing it, when you are the doer of the action in the story, you are given that power. Um, like, that is, that feeling can be more frustrating when it goes in a direction that you don't necessarily want it to go, like in a world that kind of advertises itself as like kind of giving you the agency. So I think like it's not completely like we're not our discontent in a situation like that is not wholly unfounded. Yeah, when we kind of like wanted one thing or hoped for one thing and kind of like, the game kind of like forces you in a direction that you may not necessarily uh like or find agreeable or whatever. At the same time, like this has kind of helped me like my own personal revelations have kind of helped me put it in a in this particular instance have helped me put it in a context. I've played plenty of games where I got to be like the person that I wanted to be, and one of the things about all this metaphysical stuff that we've been talking about in Elder Scrolls is that it's kind of generally understood that uh the player character in every Elder Scrolls game has achieved CHIM. And that's why like you can kind of go wherever you want, do anything you want, use any skills and powers and become insanely powerful and like oh, like, you die. Well, you reload a save because Kim, because, Dragon Break, the player has that power. Like at the end of the day, kind of like your save is your kind of like your particular playthrough is like, is your own and kind of like, the decisions that you make in it are your own. There is kind of so even though at the same time we've been talking about how like Sheogorath, the player character, the champion of Cyrodiil is mantling Sheogorath and becoming Sheogorath, there is some interesting wiggle room here and there in the game, kind of like what you were talking about with Kierkegaard earlier, and kind of like bringing like some reason to it. We were talking about I've already forgotten her name, like the crazy flesh golem lady. Like, if you when you go to her lab and she's like torturing all those people and she says, "Well, this is sanctioned by Sheogorath," you know, and just kind of a reminder to everybody that Sheogorath is not a good person.
Yeah, it's not very
But
reassuring.
but you can, yeah, it's not. But you can like even as you're mantling Sheogorath, like you can still tell her to let all of those people go, and you're still Sheogorath in some capacity while exercising like a degree of mercy and reason, which I don't know, which is interesting.
Right. Maybe you can reform what Sheogorath is.
Well, I guess thinking about it too, if Mannimarco could have two different aspects at the same time, why couldn't the Champion of Cyrodiil in a way where, you have a save that is that hero. And it's just the crazy mad god is just it's just one of those dump characters that you're just getting all the achievements for. He can be the mad god.
This actually segues really interestingly to a point that I was going to make earlier. I wasn't going to go in this direction initially, but like the conversation is kind of perfectly kind of made me realize something. I was planning to talk about like how Sheogorath has changed over the years across the games. Like, I mean, if you read like if you read like any of the books concerning Sheogorath, like you realize like, just I mean, again, like, he's a god of madness. This is not a thing of, this is not a thing of goodness. This is not a thing of balance. This is very, madness is disorder. And Sheogorath, like I was reading the Accords of Madness, and a lot of those stories are his dealings with other gods, but also kind of like how he tortures mortals in one way or another for his own purposes or, amusements or, whatever his enigmatic, godlike ways are. In some ways that are just like not they're not terribly good at all. But what's funny about Sheogorath is, and again, in context, he's talking about you, the player, as the rat in his maze that he controls. But when he said that line about cheese, everybody went crazy. Everybody went crazy like for that line. They loved that like, at that moment, Sheogorath became everyone's favorite Daedric prince. And Sheogorath is one of my favorite princes. Like, he's a fun character. He's well written. He's well, voice acted. He fills his role within the world, very nicely. But like for like kind of like going forward, every iteration of him, like you get to Skyrim, and Sheogorath is nicer. Like if you play the Elder Scrolls Blades game, which is like a mobile gotcha Elder Scrolls game, like Sheogorath shows up in there, and he's kind of like a tutorial character. He's just there to kind of help you out of the goodness of his heart. And like if you see him in ESO in Elder Scrolls Online, Sheogorath is also like he has become over the years because of his popularity from the cheese line, he has become a lot more of a fluffy, bubbly character that just talks about cheese all of the time. Like so much so that he drops the cheese line several dozen times in Elder Scrolls. Like people have counted. Like it's definitely one of those things that's overdone. And OG fans of Sheogorath kind of want him to go back to being the more sinister, like, not particularly, nice, friendly god that he kind of sort of has become. And maybe we can look at that and say, maybe the reason Sheogorath is nicer and talks about cheese all the time is because he's the champion. And the champion mantled Sheogorath, but like, like he is walking like Sheogorath, but Sheogorath is also walking like the champion. Walk like them until they walk like you, mantling. So boom, take that, Sheogorath.
It's a nice way of justifying the marketing. I do like the Sheogorath as a somewhat of a villainous maniac because that he is somebody who is, I mean, to bring it to Lewis, I know someone mentioned that hideous strength in the Discord, that this is somebody who's operating outside of natural law, somebody who's operating outside the bounds of what is rationally justifiable. He's someone who just does stuff in accordance with the power that he has. This is why he is able to give the blessing to this essentially this necromancer who is doing all kinds of like demonic experiments on people, and he gives the blessing because, well, it suits his his whims. It suits his ends in creating this gatekeeper who is going to help to defend his realm. And so, whatever it is that is going to justify him, he's going to do it. And there's a certain rationality there, but it's entirely a self-referential rationality of does this suit my ends? Not is this right, but is this right in accordance to what I want to do? And in so doing, he is really set up as, well, a postmodern, right? Of back to this will to power idea that I talked about with Vivek. Same sort of thing of I'm just going to do stuff. I'm going to create my own values, which can sound very reasonable, but in the end, it's madness because you've abandoned the reason that binds us all together. So yeah, I think that he should be kind of villainous because that's what madness actually looks like. As you said, it is disorder. It's not just you're kind of quirky. You're not a court jester. A court jester historically had a place because they were telling truth in a certain kind of capacity, right? Whereas, to be truly mad is, well, it's to be disordered. It's to be villainous. It's to be dangerous to those around you.
This this gets me thinking a little bit because, just once again, trying to order things that are disordered. But I think Ian said something that kind of triggered in my mind of looking back when you posted on there the 13 blessings of Sheogorath and looking at like the Daedric Prince of some like of madness making others suffer. What's interesting is that, in his world, in his realm, and what he's doing, it can seem like madness, but that imposing of suffering on others has this interesting role because that suffering can do for the person who's receiving the suffering in a way where it could be because blessed is the who tricks us, we are foolish, punishes us when we are wrong, tortures us when we are mindful, loves us in our imperfection. And it's interesting because like thinking of like a greater there's a greater power here. And whether Sheogorath likes it or not, his madness is playing a role here of achieving something greater than anything he can imagine. And just hearing kind of like that molding of people, like what role does madness play? What role does chaos play? Well, it's like, well, it's this shaper that punishes us, but it's good for us. Yes.
Right. I mean, the chaos that we perceive, or at least the perceived chaos that we experience, it rouses us. It causes us to step outside the mundane, that which we expect to happen. And that is when real decision arises. I mean, when life seems to be going more or less how you expect that it will, you don't recognize the decisions that you're making every single moment, right? You're just living your life. You're not really thinking about it. But when you get those disruptions, the kind of chaos that you never really asked for, and whether you get that diagnosis or someone betrays you or you lose your job through no fault of your own or like whatever it is, something happens, some perceived chaos that shakes things up. Well, now you're suddenly more aware of the decisions you have to make. How am I going to relate to the world as it's presenting itself to me right now? When in reality, as Kierkegaard says, like you're always making that decision, whether you recognize it or not. However, those times of chaos where things get shaken up, like that's when you are more aware of that decision that you have to make. And so chaos has its place. Now, hopefully you don't have a mad god who is giving you these lessons in this sort of way, but at the same time, there is truth even in the madness.
So when I think to my therapeutic work too, and thinking of, I get the clients that are kind of depressed, stuck, not going anywhere, and how everything has become so mundane, where and this is kind of something that happens just in the world that can happen easily in a world that we live in where we don't have to fear a lion around the corner everywhere we go, that we're going to get eaten, we're going to die of exposure. Like when things can become mundane, and when they do, people get so stagnant and so stuck on themselves, and so then everything becomes so internalized. Everything that they see becomes so about them and absorbed. And then when something chaotic hits them, it's just like someone who's in that zone you see where they're going to go. And it shakes them and shapes them in a way that they have to make a decision, right? And they have to do something. And it's amazing how ill prepared so many people are for that. And it just gets me thinking of like, even in a real world sense of like how to recognize or how to not get so stuck in the mundane, how to not be just a natural man, you know, and to experience, the spiritual and to experience the bigger anyways, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for the most part, our lives tend to be too small. I mean, like, I have twin 4-year-olds, and so toddlers they react what we would typically think of as overreacting, whether it's good or negative. Like everything is so dramatic to them, and that's because the context for their life is so small that everything that we see as small is quite large to them relative to their scope, to their perspective. But the problem is that, as you grow up, your world should get bigger. And so now you're able to see things in better proportion. But unfortunately, a lot of times we are not childlike, but childish, meaning we keep that small context. We become neurotic over every little thing because we don't yet see the bigger picture. We don't recognize that we are part of a larger context. The things that we perceive each and every day, that's part of a larger context. And the larger our context is, well, the better perspective we're going to have on the things that we're encountering day by day. Simultaneously, we'll recognize that the things that we tend to treat as being incredibly significant, well, maybe they're not all that significant. But at the same time, maybe the things that we tend to see as insignificant actually have a much larger role to play within a much larger world. So it kind of works in both directions. That the more air you have to breathe, well, the better you can breathe. In fact, I've got another Kierkegaard quote here. This comes from the concept of anxiety when he says, the hypochondriac is anxious about every insignificant thing, but when the significant appears, he begins to breathe more easily. Like sometimes, if you're given over to this limited, demented, right, to use the Shivering Isles kind of language, you're given over to this limited, demented, confining sort of perspective. Well, what you need is to actually encounter something substantial. Maybe the very substantial thing that you're afraid of happening. Like maybe that's exactly what you need to come before you and to sort of break you out of these confines. Like you need something real. You need to get outside of your tight little space. And sometimes, well, you need a little chaos in your life to break you out of that, and maybe even unwillingly. But if you learn to embrace that, as Spurgeon says, you learn to kiss the wave that slams you against the rock of ages, right? Like sometimes you need that, and what seems to be chaos can actually bring you to a greater order.
And then just looking at the Shivering Isles in general, with like, the seeing the two different sides, of you've Mania and Dementia. It's really interesting thinking about that. The characters that are with it are they've given themselves so over to each side that they cannot see anything else, and there's nothing else to do. There's nowhere else to go for them. So in a sense, like each side is actually there is very little chaos on each side of Dementia and Mania because unless you're moving back and forth, there is no chaos in that.
Yeah, I think that's fair. That they're both just different manifestations of misaligned order, right? They are what they are. I mean, even, mania, which we would probably most likely identify with chaos. I mean, they are so much just in abyss that there's nowhere to actually move, and so it's a kind of stability. And this is always true. I think that um, the further we get to like ultimate being and the further away we get from being, well, the more there's a kind of mimicry at play here. I think of in Dante's Divine Comedy that on one hand we have the perfect being of God, on the other side of being we have hell that's at the center of the earth, and here in the innermost circle of hell, what we have is Satan frozen over, right? The idea being that the further you are away from the warmth and being of God, well, the more you're approaching the stagnation of nothingness. But anything that exists, well, it's still there. And so the closest you can get is a different form of stability. And so the hell that Satan occupies, this innermost circle of hell, is actually a kind of mirror image of the stability of God, operating on the complete opposite sides of the spectrum of existence. Right. And so either way, there's a kind of stability at play here. And you know, in the end, like you always are where you are. And so there's no such thing as true chaos. There's only perceived chaos. Um, Boethius, the Roman philosopher, Roman Christian philosopher, says that there really is no such thing as luck. What we refer to as luck or what we refer to as fortune is really just a way of saying we're ignorant to the mechanisms at play. Right? But ultimately, all things are ordered. And so that's why our perceived chaos should be an opportunity in order to discover the actual order that's at play. There's no such thing as true chaos. But yeah, I think it's a good point that they are both different kinds of order. Well, is there anything else that is burning in your minds here?
You know what's really weird? Something that just like it keeps me up at night. It's the fact that Jyggalag, all right, so Sheogorath was originally Jyggalag. He was cursed by the other princes uh into his madness as Sheogorath so that he wouldn't like homogenize all of the Daedric realms. Because Jyggalag's a gremlin like that. But he is like the Daedra are fundamentally at their core like creatures of Padme. They are entities of change and chaos. That is that is what all of the princes are. So why the heck do we have a Padmeic Daedra of order?
Yeah, I mean, I can only assume because it's still a kind of order that's outside of the sort of meta order of the way that things ought to be. Because he's still building out his own realm, right? That's why he gets cursed by becoming Sheogorath because he's expanding his own realm of order. And so I assume that in making him the Daedric Prince of Order, it's essentially saying he's a very logical tyrant, right? Which is
Hmm.
still a kind of disorder.
Yeah, it's very interesting because it's like it's not just I mean like the kind of order that we're talking about here is everything is bleak and gray and dead and crystal and Jyggalag wants to he wants to enforce that. He wants to impose like that kind of order, that kind of tyranny onto every realm in existence. Like basically, it's a kind of disordered order that kind of that seeks to crush anything and everything that isn't it.
Right. I mean, like in Screwtape Letters, Lewis portrays hell as a bureaucracy,
Yeah.
and it's that kind of perfect bureaucracy that can be very structured. It can be very logical even, but it's still very wrong because it's a kind of order where that manifestation of order is itself disordered from the way that things ought to be.
I was thinking about I was actually thinking about Sauron too and what Tolkien says
Mhm.
about Sauron. Tolkien kind of describes like Sauron himself is like is kind of like a bureaucrat in a sense.
Right.
And like I can't remember the exact quote or where it is. That might be in one of the letters where he kind of describes Sauron in that way, in a comparable way to that. But like what's interesting about Sauron is that, if Sauron, if he can't have his way, well then if he can't have the world ordered in the way he wants personally, well then better that it's all just, barren waste and ash.
Right. And because after the defeat of his master Melkor, or Morgoth, which led to basically the destruction of the world in large part. Sauron had a desire to put things back in order. He wanted to see things healed, which is actually it's a good desire. But the problem is he defined order by himself. And so that's the problem. And so instead of being someone who's actually ordering in harmony with the way that things ought to be, bringing things back to their original purpose, he set himself up as God. And that's where things become disordered. It's why Tolkien says in letter 183, he says like the central conflict in Lord of the Rings is actually not about freedom. And that's what a lot of people tend to think that it is. As people we get freedom from tyranny. He says no, the central conflict in Lord of the Rings is actually about God and his sole right to divine honor. It's when that's lost that everything becomes disordered. And so yeah, I think that Sauron parallel comparison, I think that relates well to what we see in Jyggalag, and obviously a less profound character, but nonetheless, same basic idea at play.
Jyggalag's definitely a lot more. I would say Jyggalag is even more soulless than Sauron is. Like
Yeah, yeah,
there's like a malevolence to Sauron, and Jyggalag is just like
Ray.
crystal,
yeah. I mean,
crystal.
right. I mean, Sauron has disordered desires. Jyggalag, he's just lame. He's just boring.
Jyggalag is lame. Like lamest apocalypse. Still wouldn't want to experience it. It would be horrible. It would suck. You know, like his order knights are still going around slaughtering everybody. Like that's not good. But like as far as villains go, I mean, I can understand why the other princes might want to spice things up a little bit as far as Jyggalag is concerned, while also keeping him contained.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I want to live under Sheogorath or Jyggalag. I'm not sure which I would pick.
I was actually thinking about something interesting earlier, which is that there are various cultures of Daedra worshippers within the Elder Scrolls that don't necessarily they honor the Daedra. Like the Reachmen, for example, in Skyrim, they actually have this really interesting culture where it's like, okay, the Daedra, we don't necessarily these are not we worship them not because they are beings worthy of our love and devotion and affection, but because they are beings that are uh worthy of respect and fear. And that they the kind of like they have harsh lessons to teach us, but those lessons that they teach us are kind of like what help us to uh survive in what is itself kind of like a very cruel world. And that's not me glazing the Daedra like in any way, but it is an interesting perspective to think about, like, okay, like these peoples don't always view their gods with love, but with that I don't know if grudging respect is the word.
Yeah, I mean they're looking for
They have to take
some
them seriously.
right. They're looking for some stability in a world that is inherently chaotic, right? Everybody looks for some kind of anchor. I mean, even if it's not necessarily good. Reminds me of another C.S. Lewis quote. Where men are forbidden to honor a king, they will honor millionaires, athletes, film stars instead, even famous prostitutes or gangsters. For
Every
spiritual
time.
nat- for spiritual nature, like bodily nature, will be served. Deny it food, it will gobble poison. And so we're all looking for something to worship, right? And so
Hmm.
we're looking for something to honor, right? And so if you don't have kind of good models to follow, well, then you're going to follow bad models, but you're always going to follow some kind of model, right? And so the Daedric lords provide some reference point, like some direction of where to go. Like these are obviously strong beings, and we're weak little mortals, and so why not? Maybe it's the best option that we have.
Hmm.
Um, they're like the red pill bros for all the
Oh
young guys
God.
looking for someone to follow. They might not be good, but
Yeah.
they've got some dynamism behind them.
Hmm. So
Well,
Shivering Isles is fun.
Yeah, yeah. In conclusion, Shivering Isles is very fun. All right, cool.
Like,
Uh,
comment, and subscribe.
yes, exactly. Head over to Patreon and all right, yeah. So I mean, I enjoyed this talk. I feel like it's gone a good length here to go ahead and wrap things up. We covered a lot of ground here, large scale, small scale, everything between. Next time we will move on to Skyrim, and I will see you around the Discord. Until next time.
Thank you, sir. Good night.